Hello and welcome to Infrastructure Matters by IPWEA, the podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic world of infrastructure, asset management and public works. I'm your host, David Jenkins, Chief Executive of IPWEA, and in today's episode, we have the pleasure of hosting Ross Copland, CEO of the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. Ross recently spoke at our International Public Works Conference in Melbourne, where he provided a wealth of insights on the importance of renewing existing infrastructure, the challenges posed by climate change, and the crucial role of leadership and accountability in asset management. Grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and let's delve into the transformative strategies and innovative approaches that are shaping the future of infrastructure management. I'm delighted that we've got Ross Copland today joining us. Ross has been speaking at our International Public Works Conference here in sunny Melbourne, and it was certainly a fantastic presentation with a number of different questions. So very keen to get Ross to join the podcast and to answer a few questions. Now, in the session at the end, I sort of talked about some of the research and key insights that the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission does and commissions. And your last report I really found quite interesting, which is your build and maintain report. Maybe you could tell the audience just a bit about that report and some of the high-level findings.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity, Dave. It's been an interesting piece of work. What it revealed to us was we've got a bit over $260 billion of assets that we're looking after, which is a pretty huge responsibility, but that asset base within the data, we can clearly see it's aging more quickly than we're replacing it. And when you start to disaggregate the spend in infrastructure services, maintenance renewals, new builds, the numbers come out to say that around 60% of all investment needs to go into renewing that existing asset base, not building new stuff. And that's a pretty big swing from where we are today. So a pretty important finding, we really need to be pivoting the focus away from new build capital additions. That's still important. It's still going to happen. It's required, particularly as our country's growing and we've got this level of service aspirations. But increasingly, the focus needs to be on looking after and replacing the existing asset base. Second thing, kind of key finding there was we're continuing to invest pretty heavily. So from 1990, we had about $33,000 of infrastructure value per New Zealander. That's grown to nearly $55,000 as at 2022 per person. And we're spending something in the order of 5.8% of GDP every year on infrastructure. And that actually puts us now in the top end of high-income countries for what we're spending. Mm-hmm. There's been a sort of a common narrative in New Zealand that we don't spend enough. And that myth is busted. What we don't do is we don't get enough value from that investment when we make it. So our productivity rates are very low. And the amount of infrastructure we're able to deliver per unit capital invested is pretty poor relative to other countries. So that's really the focus for that spending. Those are the key takeaways.
So let's go back to that first point, and I guess it's around changing the vernacular here around, it's not just about building new, it's also about, what we've currently got and making sure we look after it. That's not dissimilar to many countries around the world, where same conversations. So I guess I'm keen to understand, in your role and in the Infrastructure Commission, how are you trying to change that thinking? How are we trying to get people focused? Look, it's not just about building the shiny new asset. It's also about looking after the existing asset base that we have. How are you sort of beginning to change that?
What I'd say to start with, New Zealanders are doing it for us. So they are taking photographs of leaky roofs in hospitals, sending them to the media. Yep. In my presentation this morning, I put up a picture of a gentleman who's been sneaking around in the night, drawing images on New Zealand roads. Yep. Out of sheer frustration at the lack of action, if you like, on pretty dangerous potholes and road safety issues. That manifestation of inappropriate or insufficient asset management and maintenance activities. So there's a narrative out there where the public want this. Yep. If the public want it, it's interesting to politicians. And if it's interesting to politicians, we have an audience, we have a customer for what we're selling. Yep. And so what we've been focusing on is, well, what is it that we need to convince politicians of? What are the sort of low-hanging fruit opportunities that they can prosecute? Yep. We have a very short electoral cycle, 3 years in New Zealand. that means we've got to get through, if it takes a year for governments to get their feet under the desk, you've got about 18 months to make some changes, and then you're into campaign mode for the next election. So we're in the kind of, year of getting your feet under the desk, educating ministers, explaining the evidence base, and then starting to prosecute the recommendations at the early stages. So, boring but important stuff like issuing Cabinet Office circulars that require asset owning agencies to make certain disclosures and to do certain things around their asset base. It's really important sort of hygiene stuff that has slipped over time that we're trying to get government back into.
Yeah. And when we talk about hygiene stuff, and I mentioned this in one of my questions to you, we've done a State of the Assets report. We work with the Australian Local Government Association. We do that. We deliver that report. And not only does it look at the different asset classes and what state of repair these various different asset classes are in, it also goes down to the capacity and the capability. So we know that 67% of councils who actually have an asset management plan a third of those aren't linking it to a long-term financial plan. We know that there's a third of local government that still is not using or actively using an asset management plan. At what point does this sort of come down to the sort of just doing the basics and we're not doing the basics, which is then linked to the sort of the capacity and capability in the sector? And then also there's this whole issue around funding as well. But how, if you sort of look at those key areas, is there something that you prioritize over others when we sort of talk about managing infrastructure assets?
Yeah, you've got to start somewhere, and you need a sort of theory of change. If you are trying to transform practice in a sector, you have to have a really deliberate way of going about that. For us, that's been starting to think about leadership and thinking about who are the parties that consider themselves responsible for the stewardship of the asset base. And if it's not easy to identify those parties, that's the first problem. And if you can identify those parties, but they're tier 4 in an organisation, they have very limited influence over budgets, over capital program, over priorities for the institution as well. So leadership is critical, and being super clear about who is accountable, how they're empowered, gives you the opportunity to then, if you've got a funding gap, for example, to start raising a business case, a change, an intervention which delivers the funding that they need. So for me and for our organisation, we have got a big focus on leadership. We've also got a big focus on working with the other, what you might call kind of system leads and stewards in New Zealand. So the Office of the Auditor General does a lot of work looking at the asset management plans and capability and competence of local government. The Commerce Commission, who regulate regulated sectors, spend considerable time poring over the asset management plans of regulated electricity networks and so on, and the information disclosure requirements there. Those disciplines and that oversight leads to dramatically better performance, better reliability, more consistent costs to consumers, more consistent investment levels. So a lot of what we're doing is the storytelling that says this is not impossible, and we know that by looking at other sectors operating in the same environmental context as you are, i.e. the planning laws, the labour laws, the regulatory requirements of New Zealand, and you can do this subject to the right kind of drivers and incentives. So the drivers and incentive gaps is also a big part of what we're trying to fill.
So when we talk about, so the foundations, the foundations of an asset management plan, linking it to a long-term financial plan, the basics, right? It is a carrot and stick approach, right? So you can say, well, you need to understand your asset base, first of all. You need to understand, the life cycle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's also the stick approach, right? And the regulator, and actually, as you've just said, you've got to have clear oversight, because if you don't have that, what's not measured is not managed, essentially. So do you think, is that balance right in New Zealand in terms of the oversight, the regulation, but also, encouraging people to sort of do the basics? I mean, do you think the balance is right?
I'd answer that by saying we have... Let's talk about procurement rules. We have several hundred pages of rules of sourcing. It's pretty hard to police how agencies procure. We have close to 1,000 pages in our environmental planning statute, the Resource Management Act in New Zealand. I think it's 980 pages or something crazy.
Right.
When you design systems that require regulation and oversight and then don't regulate and you don't look back and provide that oversight, it's pretty hard to get performance improvement. And it's, if you're not policing speeding, people speed. If you're not, in fact, something I didn't mention this morning, but there's sort of anecdata that suggests that the policing of heavy vehicle overweight loads on our roads has really dropped off in recent years. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the sort of anecdote. And, that kind of thing starts to show up in asset failure. And so I do see evidence in our country of regulations that are unenforced, not monitored, data's not collected, and there isn't a customer for that data. So it's not clear who's worried about it or who should be caring in some cases if that's not happening. And I guess in the absence of that, that's us. We're sort of saying, well, we'll put our hand up for the New Zealand consumer who over generations have contributed to this capital stock. They have an expectation that it's cared for and looked after, and you need to hand the jersey back in better condition than you found it, type thing, to use a sort of All Blacks analogy. But this idea of stewardship and caring for what we have is pretty central for us. So, certainly in the short term, until you can systematically go through and say, well, who's the customer, who's buying that report and acting on it if it doesn't happen. If you can't succinctly answer that question, that's a place where we're trying to show up and say, well, we're interested.
I like the All Blacks analogy. But and let's go back to your other point just around, because I think it's an interesting one, and we get this feedback a lot from our members, in terms of the governance and the leadership. And I understand, I'm not a technical expert, but I understand the ISO standards that are coming out, the new ones are very much focused on leadership and driving leadership of this stuff and asset management right across an organisation.
This is in 55,000?
Yes, that's right. Sorry, 55,000. Yeah, that's right. But in terms of, and we think about elected members, right? And so often they come from various different backgrounds. They could be running the, particularly in remote rural areas, they could be running the bakery, they could be very successful business people, they're running a trucking firm, agriculture, but with all the best intentions, but they now find themselves, the custodian of a significant asset base with a significant amount of money. How do we sort of work with those elected members to make sure that they really do understand asset management, because they're making critical decisions, and particularly from a leadership perspective?
I would say, while it doesn't immediately appear intuitive, there's an analogy that works for almost anybody. Everyone who owns a vehicle knows what happens if you don't change the oil and tyres. Eventually, you get a flatty, and you're walking, or your engine blows up if you eventually don't change your oil. So it's pretty intuitive. Most people that own a home know that, if you don't paint your weatherboards, you're going to have to replace them. And eventually, you can find an analogy that works for most people. Business, particularly people that have been in business, they will intuitively know that they can sweat their asset base so long, but their risk of reliability and outages, and therefore upsetting customers or missing orders, increases depending on whatever their business might be. So we try to do a bit of storytelling and sort of connect with people, particularly leaders who may not be familiar with the lingo of asset management, but everyone knows what happens if you don't paint the roof. Like eventually you're replacing it, and that's considerably more expensive. What I would say, I talked to my wife about this, which bores her to death, but it's a kind of a similar issue in her world. She's a GP. And GPs are kind of like the asset managers of public health, right? So they're out there saying, get your immunisations, eat well, get plenty of sleep, exercise regularly, and you won't need to have a re-roofing. You won't have this catastrophe in your life where you need a triple bypass or something because you didn't manage your weight. And what we see around Western countries, Western democracies, is public health and general practice is grossly underfunded, and it's just not as exciting as announcing, a new theatre to deliver 10,000 hip surgeries or whatever. And it's exactly the same as infrastructure, where the political class tends to be drawn to the shiny new thing, the new build, the announcement, the ribbon cutting. There's nobody turning up to announce coil cleaning on the air handling units at the hospital.
Yep.
That's just not a thing.
Yep.
That might be a really important thing to do when you've got a lot of viral loading in the air conditioning system and you've got COVID or something, but nobody's interested. So that seems to be the challenge we face mostly, and you can look at health, you can look at all these different areas where the focus still is on the new build or the new shiny thing, and the caring for what we've got, whether it's our own health or our assets, tends to get neglected.
And you raised, and you said just previously, talked about storytelling, and we often tell our members about, the importance as an asset manager. You understand all the technical components, but it's actually about telling the story and telling the story in a meaningful language that people can understand, right? And I think that's an issue across all professions, right? It's being able to tell the story to the layman, and you've got the technical expertise that essentially sits behind it. But if
you do need the data though, right? So
yes.
A lot of people love telling stories.
Yep.
And then you probe a little and there's not much there.
No.
So something we've been quite focused on at the Commission is really trying to gather the evidence base and say, well, yeah, we're going to tell the story, but if someone challenges the story, we can back it up in numbers.
Yep.
And we can benchmark it, we can compare it to other jurisdictions, we can compare your sector to another sector. And that's, I think, the difference between a compelling story and an interesting story.
Yeah.
If you're compelled to make change, or if you want to compel people to make change, particularly where it requires trade-offs, like funding, maintenance, requires pretty hard trade-offs for politicians because they want to build the shiny new thing. Yeah. So to be able to do that, you need a compelling story and you need data and evidence.
But I mean, and you said, and I agree, people, particularly business people, inherently understand, and you use some great analogies there around, if you don't look after your car, the tires are going to fall off, et cetera, et cetera. But we still live in a short-term political world, right? So, 3-year cycles, you're elected and you're thinking about, okay, how do I get re-elected? So in a short-term political world, and that's no dissimilar to New Zealand, across the globe in the Western democracy, is it something to do with the political cycle as well? Do we need to change that to sort of get to people's thinking to change as well? It's the actual sort of system that we operate in.
Yeah, I used to have this boss that said, Ross, don't try to boil the ocean.
Yeah.
So I don't think the Infrastructure Commission is going to change the political cycles in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But what I do think we can do is make the political economy of making the right choice.
Yes.
And making a good decision.
Yes.
Something that's rewarded by the constituency.
Yeah.
And if I give an example, something that we've been quite drawn to at the Commission is the Infrastructure Australia have this infrastructure priority list, and it sort of does what it says on the box. So they assess independently a business case or a proposal, and they say, yeah, that makes sense. That's a priority for the state or the Commonwealth to fund at some point. Yep. And they add it to the list as an endorsed investment. So what happens when the political class, who may have given something a fleeting thought, perhaps haven't done a lot of work on a business case and things like that, and decide to announce a really big new thing, the journalists now, 10 years down the track with this IPL, the journalists are trained to say, well, has Infrastructure Australia seen that? Yeah. What do they think about it?
Yeah.
And they're suddenly doing your work for you. They're saying, well, has it been independently assessed? Do the benefits exceed the costs? Like, they're asking the right question. And I think if so essentially the politician that makes the crazy announcement without having done the homework and so on starts to feel a little bit awkward, like, oh, actually no, we haven't really done the maths on this, and we think it's a nice idea, but don't worry, it'll be great. And they're saying, well, the political economy for that is changing. And it's changing because of an intervention in information, an intervention around transparency, and an intervention in educating those who act for the public, in many cases being the media, who ask the probing question.
Let's change topic a little bit. So on your presentation, you talk about climate change impacting New Zealand, climate change and some of the big events, and now same thing here in Australia, as in many parts of the world. So this sort of brings more of a focus on infrastructure because, it's like, are we using the right materials? Are we building back better? Should we even be building in places where we got, flood prone and looking at all that sort of stuff? So how do you see how does that all play out in New Zealand from your purview as head of the Infrastructure Commission? position? What are you saying, and what are you how are you dealing with this whole climate change and impact in New Zealand itself?
So New Zealand is a series of islands surrounded by the Pacific Ocean and the Southern Ocean to the south. So when global sea levels get warmer, we get more moisture in our atmosphere and more intense rainfall events. It's kind of just hydrological science that's going on around us, and that's manifesting in pretty extreme ways for us now. So we're starting to see more intense rainfall events during the cyclone Gabrielle that we had there recently. One of our government science organisations did a study of the slips that occurred through that event, and there were hundreds of thousands of slips in land that had previously not been considered slip-prone land. So there's quite an extreme change with massive environmental impacts as well, in terms of slope stability and all of those things. And that cascades into network failure. If you have unstable slopes and you've been able to get away with quite a steep batter on the edge of your roads and your rail network, and suddenly that batter can't hold and you've got to clear off, tons of dirt and material that's coming down across the road every time there's a major rain event, that starts to eat into your pavement renewals budget. It starts to eat into your bridge renewals budget because you're moving dirt that you didn't used to have to touch.
Yeah.
On the other side, I'd say as well, though, it's bringing a stronger focus to why we need to do the maintenance. If you drive along a typical New Zealand road on any given day and it starts to rain, you'll see rainwater accumulating in culverts at a much faster rate than it probably should. Basic maintenance of things like culverts and keeping things flowing, keeping our drainage systems operating is seemingly gone on the back burner. And that's the kind of stitch in time saves nine stuff that we need to be doing. If we have saturated subbases on pavements, they start to collapse. And it's that kind of hidden cost, if you like, of you think you're getting away with it, but you're not. So the climate change story, I think, for New Zealand, I think is something that intuitively our engineers are pretty acutely aware of. We've certainly dealt with resilience through our earthquake prone sort of design requirements and so on for a long time. So thinking about return periods for big events is something we intuitively do. But the challenge I think we've got is where to place that marginal resilience dollar and finding that balance between the sort of Hippocratic Oath concept of do no harm, which is your point about, do you red zone land that might be inundation prone in 100 years versus saying, well, you don't have to red zone anything. The Dutch have proved that you can live below sea level, but it's expensive, relatively speaking, to do so. It requires standards. It requires the absolute highest order of asset management capability. I wouldn't want to live behind a levee that had a dodgy pump system keeping it functional. So New Orleans kind of tells us what happens when you do that. So you've got choices, and I think as engineers, we as a community of practice need to be better at kind of putting to people their choices. So if you happen to live behind a stop bank, but you aren't systematically maintaining that stop bank asset, you are running a tremendous risk as we go into the next sort of 30 years with increasingly intense rainfall events. If, with all the best will in the world, our regional councils who look after our river systems and catchments have taken quite a strong view about maintaining sediment in waterways, and as a result have probably tended to prevent or prohibit the extraction of material from New Zealand braided river systems and so on. That's got a benefit ecologically, but it also has a cost, and the cost of that is the channels are filling up with material which we are no longer extracting. We've confined the path of that new river, or that river, by creating stop banks along the side of it, and that requires maintenance. And the year you stop doing that maintenance, your stop bank starts shrinking. And so it's that, I guess, as engineering and asset management professionals, this kind of articulating back to decision makers what we've done to manipulate the environment over time, and how that's going to change and how our asset management practices will need to change as well.
And what do you, I mean, in terms of learning, in terms of what New Zealand can take to the world in terms of asset management and engineering practice, what do you think New Zealand can teach the world, but also what do you think, if looking from a global best practice, what are other countries that you're looking at going, actually, they're doing that pretty well, and what we could take some of that and use that here in New Zealand?
Yeah, I probably tend to feel like I'm beating up on ourselves quite a lot because we're always looking for the thing that isn't quite working.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of great things about being in a small country with a very simple government structure.
Yeah.
You're only probably 2 or 3 degrees removed from the Prime Minister at any given time in New Zealand, that kind of thing. So being small and nimble is super helpful in so many ways. New Zealand has got very good at responding to crises. As a result of having quite a few.
Yeah.
So weather events, terrorism events, that kind of thing. In recent years, I think we've demonstrated as a country that we're very responsive. We're able to get back on our feet quickly. What I would say, though, I would like us to not have such acute crises because we're better prepared.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we are looking to learn from other countries. I gave the example earlier. I was sort of chatting with the Queensland Recovery Authority, making plans in peacetime so that in wartime it's very clear who's paying for the cleanup, what compensation might be available, what sort of emergency debt financing might be available to local government, for example, that kind of thing. Having those conversations in a sane, measured, rational, low politics environment is super helpful. And that kind of thing for New Zealand, I think would be really beneficial to have those conversations up front. And we've got a great agency there in NEMA who lead a lot of that work for us. But that's the kind of thing where we see the likes of, Queensland Recovery Authority or others doing great work. We try to bring that. We also, like the infrastructure bodies around the world, we regularly catch up and connect. We're sharing examples. We're interfacing. I met with your New South Wales Treasury when I was there in Sydney yesterday. We are trying to keep in touch and take best practices and learnings, and likewise share our findings and research. So I think that is functioning pretty well, and tending to see, we've been doing a lot of engagement with Canadians lately around their PPP procurement, particularly Infrastructure Ontario, and they've done some great work there. So we're always trying to share examples of what's working well, and that network of infrastructure bodies seems to be functioning really well.
Yeah, just on Canada, I mean, their sort of government took a view that they really wanted to invest in capacity and capability in asset management and put their money where their mouth is and put quite a considerable amount of funding into that area. Just a little bit about Ross the person. So you came from very much a commercial background, Westfield originally, and you've gone into this role. So why the change? Why did you suddenly go, yep, okay, I wanted to get into the sort of the government space, I want to get out. What was it? I mean, it's clear you've got a passion for this, but what made the move?
Yeah, well, maybe to go back, I left school and I joined the Air Force, and I was an engineer working on maintaining airplanes, or helicopters actually. So I sort of got this training that I think is exceptionally high quality training around asset management, looking after a critical asset where if you make a mistake, if you leave a tool in the wrong place, the crew die. Yeah. And that's quite sobering as a young technician. Yeah. And so I sort of went on from there. I studied engineering and went into construction and ended up at Westfield in a role where I was looking after a property portfolio that was worth a lot of money, and had an owner who was really interested in their asset, and had co-owners who they managed that asset on behalf of, that they had sort of duties to. And so I think for me, over my career, it's been this sort of asset management is not the only thing I've done, but it's something that has really resonated with me as a discipline that's absolutely critical to services. And infrastructure exists for the purposes of delivering services. You don't do the maintenance on the helicopter for fun. You do it so that you can be deployed, and you can actually run a search and rescue operation successfully or whatever. Yeah. If that machine is not in an airworthy condition, you can't deliver. You can't rescue the person off the rocks type thing. So I'm always thinking about, what's the end game here? What are we actually trying to do? If I've got kids, if my kids are sitting in a classroom that doesn't have the minimum outside air requirement, that has really poor acoustic performance that hasn't had the carpet upgraded and they're tripping and falling or whatever. It's just not a good learning environment. Or the staff facilities are no good, so they can't retain their teaching staff. It matters to me. That's really important. If the end game is we want an educated, smart future generation who can hopefully pay some tax and keep us all alive when we're retired. That's the kind of end game, and so that's very motivating for me. I ended up at the Infrastructure Commission by virtue of COVID, so I was running some big tourism infrastructure project that when COVID hit, the whole thing ground to a very rapid halt. And so I was sort of thinking, well, I'm not going to twiddle my thumbs waiting for 5 years for the economy to get back on its feet. I felt this fire in my belly around just how hard it is to get stuff done and build things and do things, and saw the Infrastructure Commission as an amazing opportunity to try and really prosecute some change, have this. It was a new organisation, but modelled closely off other successful infrastructure bodies around the world, in the UK, Canada and Australia primarily, and just saw it as this amazing opportunity to get together with ministers and a really smart group of people and try to build an evidence base for change.
And so if we just sit down in a couple of years' time and have the same conversation, where do you sort of where do you see the Infrastructure Commission moving to? What do you want to sort of say? Yeah, we have achieved this, and I'm very proud of the team and what we've managed to do here. Where do you sort of see that going?
Yeah, we're trying to write about this at the moment because, being part of government, you have these things called statements of performance expectations.
Yeah.
So we've got these big outcome documents, but it is tricky because you are trying to turn the big ship, if you like, of this tremendous group of people and series of organisations gently on a sort of a wide arc. But I think there's some pretty obvious, quite low-hanging fruit things that I think we can get done. We're going through planning reform in New Zealand at the moment, and the previous government started. This government's carrying on. We've sort of gone back a step to go forward. They've repealed some stuff that the previous government put in place. But for me, a functional planning system is critical. And our planning system in New Zealand is not fit for purpose right now. It certainly doesn't work for infrastructure. It might be okay for sort of consenting your backyard swimming pools or something. I'm not sure actually what sector it works for, but it certainly doesn't work for major infrastructure providers. So our team's very focused on that. The government has asked us to develop a national infrastructure plan. So that's kind of an altitude a bit closer to the action than our strategy, which is very principles-based. It talks about the importance of asset management, leadership, that kind of stuff. And the infrastructure plan is the next level down. So it's starting to model out infrastructure needs for New Zealand. So we're looking ahead that 30 years, looking at population growth, level of service changes, climate and resilience challenges, electrification, these other big investment drivers, and making recommendations together with the asset owning agencies responsible for those networks back to government. So that's a big piece of work that we've got a target to deliver that a first draft in June next year. That's a massive one. In the delivery area, our productivity rates are shocking.
Right.
They really are. And this is not some weird science. We are over-specifying. We are not managing design efficiently. I was sort of engaging on a project recently, a multi-billion-dollar project, and I asked a very simple question: who's in charge of the design? I've asked it to probably 20 people, never got a straight answer. And if you as a client don't know who owns the scope, it's very hard to deliver a project. Very, very hard. And you'll tend to see that project having scope creep issues, rework issues, cost and program issues, and all those things are manifesting. So there's some quite simple stuff I believe we can try and address in that delivery world. So that across strategy, policy and delivery, those are kind of three big rocks that we're trying to move on quite quickly.
Good. Ross, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for coming over here, flying to see us today and to speaking to all the audience, and also for taking the time to speak to us on Infrastructure Matters. We wish you all the very best, and I look forward to seeing you in New Zealand very soon when I make the trip in the next few months. But thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Dave.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Infrastructure Matters by IPWEA. A big thank you to our esteemed guest, Ross Copland, for sharing his invaluable insights and experiences in infrastructure management and leadership. Today's conversation highlighted not only the challenges we face, but also the innovative solutions and best practices being implemented in New Zealand and beyond. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope today's discussion has broadened your understanding of the critical role of infrastructure in our communities. Stay tuned for more episodes where we delve into the world of infrastructure and public works. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more engaging conversations. I'm David Jenkins, signing off and reminding you that in the realm of infrastructure, every detail matters.